The Shrinking, written by Oliver Arnold, Part 7 of the series, Notes from the Ahead, narrated by Adam 11 Labs.
Dear public, you're listening to what could be my final message. The jury-rigged batteries are dying, and I'm transmitting these notes as I write them. It has been a breathless journey, both for myself and our guide. My part is coming to an end. It still impresses me that our future friend went through the trouble of sending these notes, or the plans for the time machine. If the intent was to improve life in the past, though, they have failed. I am miserable. I have not been granted closure, and it disappoints me greatly that I won't be meeting our mysterious friend. You should know that I'm not sending you these notes only to whine about myself. Understand that I've received another transmission. I scribbled it into the sand overnight, in a trance-like condition. When I woke in the morning, the beach's sand was filled with scribbles. I shall now transmit those notes for your listening pleasure. I have not read the text, and thus we shall learn together what this upcoming report reveals.
Beginning of transcription. Hey, Post. Much has happened lately, and it's time for an update. At first, I wanted to name this report a petite portrait of the greats to match the magnitude and spirit of what I encountered, but then opted for the much shorter title, The Shrinking. After all, this is no novel, but an adventurous account of the events in my life. I was en route to the starport, yes, it's called that, even though people travel merely from orbit, to pick up Astrid when I received a message. Urgent, the headline read. A sky-slicking buddy I'd met during my tumultuous descent to Earth had split from his group during an outing and vanished somewhere on the South American continent. I knew from experience that they enjoyed entering the atmosphere along the equator to then spiral down toward the Arctic. If anything went wrong, these guys were notoriously difficult to locate, as they traveled so far from civilization. For them, it was part of the thrill. The rescue service is looking for volunteers to comb the vast and deserted areas of jungle in South America, a friend told me. The guy missing had saved me from certain death during the hot-down. There was no way I'd abandon him in his time of need. I reprogrammed my flyer, checked the fuel gauge, and headed south for the dead center of the American jungle, toward the coordinates assigned by the rescue team. It was morning, and the flight computer affirmed that I could arrive by dinner. If I found my friend within 5 minutes, I could make it back in time to pick up my wife and be only 2 hours late. The computer calculated the odds for achieving this at 1 in 292 million. I messaged Astrid. She took the news much better than expected. Her reply was instant. Be there or be divorced. I instructed Astrid, who'd never been on Earth, to stand in the rain if she got bored. It's like taking a shower outside. As you may recall from my past adventures, my marital relations had been tense after my moving to Earth. Yet my Borealis boarding friend had saved my life. How could I not return the favor in like terms? Following down the coast, I soon veered inland, and not much later a green crescent broke the horizon. I had reached the tropics. I had left the gray confusion of civilization for a greener one 1,000 miles away. Buildings thinned and vehicles sparsed. An enormous wilderness that stretched as far as the eye could see spread out before me. How do we live in a world of 60 billion people and still have undeveloped wilderness? If this confuses you, stay with me for an answer. Neither humanity nor alienity cared for this region of Terra, and they knew this. As I flew over the green jungle, I came to appreciate the scope of the area. This region was truly wild, no less desolate, empty, or abandoned than outer space. In this environment, it was easy to feel as isolated as in deep space. By now, no vehicles, no structures, and no civilization were in sight. After another hour or so, staring at the unending fuzzy green blanket lulled me, much like gazing at the ocean did. A soothing sight, yes, but also rather dull. But now wasn't the time to relax, as I had reached my target search area. Just then, a change of color caught my eye, low down beneath the canopy. I slowed my flyer, turned, and could now distinctly make out a bluish-gray tint of various straight lines that neither matched the natural scheme of color nor the organic shapes of the plants. Was it rock? No, it held an iridescent sheen. There had to be a structure down below, built into a densely forested canyon. I lowered my flyer as close to the trees as I dared, but reducing the distance did not allow me to see past the canopy. An overwhelming curiosity overcame me. I hovered and found an opening wide enough to do the unthinkable. Lower down into the forest below, a dark and dangerous wilderness, to land the flyer. Why I let myself get distracted by this structure in this matter, I do not know to this day, but a fortunate distraction it sure was. As I descended, large branches began to scrape the ship's hull. Had I purchased the scratch protection waiver for this rental? Leaves were getting sucked into the black hole drive and turned into puffs of antimatter. Enormous birds perched on the branches around me. An immense swallow flew by, capable of living up to its name. The area teemed with bugs and other crawlies. Being among the trees didn't improve my visibility. The structure, if it had been one, was no longer visible. I still hadn't reached the ground. The trees were gigantic, towering hundreds of feet high, rivaling the tallest buildings in Terra's greatest cities. Unnervingly, I found that my radio had blacked out, perhaps because of the thick greenery for which neither space nor ground-based communication systems were designed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the forest floor came into sight. I landed the flyer slowly and cautiously, uncertain of the stability of the mossy substrate below. The last thing I needed was fouled skids, sinking into some murk, or sliding off a cliff to live out my days in the brush. Suddenly, a jerk. The ship had settled, and all had gone smoothly. It sat on the ground, dwarfed and consumed by monumental grass and trees. I, as a spacer, knew the meaning of vastness, yet those voids are well beyond our senses. They're abstractly oversized, beyond fathom, while the enormity here was well within my reach and awe. I looked around. Still no hint of a structure. The wild nature of the place astounded me. Its oversized insects, the animals unknown to me. Yellow pollen began to cover the ship's hull. Then, in a spontaneous decision that to this day astonishes me, I opened the ship's protective canopy, removing any hope for a quick emergency escape. Warm, moist air caused my skin to prick, whether from clogged pores or unknown microorganisms, I knew not. The canopy misted over, and the ship chimed a warning from within. After sneezing a few times, I stepped out and resealed the cockpit, turning the AC to 11, pleased at how quickly it cleared the humidity inside. Above, the sky that had been my safe haven was now nearly invisible, obscured by tall grass, a rarity in our cities, where artificial plants of a more manageable size are preferred. I took in the calm, unhurried quality of the surrounding sounds, the smell of moist soil and the rustling of unseen life. Periodic animal noises both scared and intrigued me. A whisper of leaves stirred, hopefully just a breeze. I was engulfed by an incredible peace. Lying down on a patch of moss, I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by a sense of tranquility unlike any I had ever experienced. Had a poison dart struck me? Was this a toxin at work designed to soothe before devouring its victim? Despite the potential dangers, I dozed off. I woke by what sounded like a growl, much like an animal's, but 1,000 times louder. The very tall bushes nearby rustled. Suddenly, an enormous, supersized hog emerged from the green. The monster, easily the size of a building, burst from the brush with enormous speed, its snout busily combing the dirt in front of it. It headed my way, and in just a moment it would detect me. I had no time to react. Would I become a snack, or rather get trampled to death? Then, the beast stopped, hearing an even grander movement from behind. It froze for an instant, and then ran off in the opposite direction whence it came. I was saved, but wasted no time in contemplation, and rushed for my flyer. I was just about to step onto the cockpit's ladder when the light darkened, dimmed by something vast approaching from behind. I faced a decision. Would I exit this world without knowing what had destroyed me, or confront the terror eyes wide open? I chose confrontation and turned to lay eyes upon a sight not at all believable. Towering above me was an enormous figure, a giant man, whose sheer presence dwarfed my understanding of possible. "Hello?" the monster said, modulating its voice in an attempt to not overwhelm my senses. After that greeting, the 300-foot monstrosity did much of nothing. It looked down at me, perhaps with as much wonder as I had looking up at it. There was no chance or risk of getting crushed as the giant stood perfectly still, and so did I. He, as this was a male from what I could fathom, seemed to not believe his eyes to meet a tiny person. His attire was surprisingly mundane, reminiscent of a fashion that might have graced the streets of Earth centuries ago. Even nowadays, in any city on Terra, he wouldn't have stood out too much, though, apart from his size. "You are a giant," I exclaimed. "Yes," he said. "And you were one of us." "How do you mean, I, a giant?" The claim took my breath away. "Well, not you personally," the giant said, "but your people. Your ancestors were what you consider giants. They were like me." I shook my head in disbelief. "I am at a loss for what you're suggesting, giant," I said. At this, the huge being took a deep breath, and instantly the air was free of bugs and leaves. "I'm no giant," he said, "merely a descendant of those who decided to remain at humanity's true size." I had to ponder on this for a minute, play through the statement's consequences, and then ask, "Are you suggesting that carrots have not always been the size of a house?" At this, the giant smiled. "The carrot's size hasn't changed," he pondered. "What do you know about the Great Shrinking?" "Great Shrinking?" I searched my memory. "Nothing," I admitted. The giant nodded knowingly. "The world forgets quickly. It only takes 2 generations or so, and truth be told, we like to keep it that way." I contemplated. "But why do you say we?" I asked. "I'm not alone." I stumbled backward. "There are others? How does the world not know about you?" "How many?" "Oh, only about a dozen or so," the giant said. "But words are dwarfs, deeds are giants," he added, grinning. "Let me show you." He lowered his open hand. "Hop on for a faster, more comfortable journey. Our settlement is only a few steps for me, but a day's travel for you, I'm afraid." I crawled onto the giant's spread-out hand and was lifted onto his shoulder. When the enormous hand lifted me, I got a little woozy as I rose fast, hundreds of feet to his shoulder, faster than any atomic elevator or flyer had lifted me before. My expectation for a much improved view from this height was disappointed. "He who rides on the giant's shoulders sees no further than he who carries him," I said, quoting, and hesitated. I knew nothing about this huge person I trusted with my life. "Maybe I'll take the flyer instead," I said. "The tree canopy is very dense, and for good reason," the giant said. "We don't value eyes or visitors." "Climb into my ear," the giant said with a welcoming smile. I followed the invitation. It was warm and cozy in there. The large creature giggled. I held on to the thick strands of hair. "Now I don't have to scream anymore," I said normally. We traveled for about 5 minutes through dense brush that seemed as tricky to navigate for the giant as it would have been for me down below. After reaching what counted as a clearing in these dense woods, the man's enormous steps carried us down a slope, and there it lay, the structure I had observed earlier, a sizable metallic construct with an open frame shaped cubically with what appeared to be cables running all over it, cables the thickness of a person my size. The center floor formed a slightly concave platform built out of concentric rings. Despite its dimensions, the thing stood submerged entirely within the jungle, the tallest trees easily surpassing it by hundreds of feet. The construct gleamed in the sun, and no activity was visible around it. It appeared abandoned and as if it had been long in disuse. "What is it?" I asked the giant, pointing. "That," and here the giant cleared his throat, "I will explain later." Just when I raised my voice in protest, he lifted his mighty arm to open up the view ahead to a sight that quieted me. The parting branches revealed an oversized village. Here, men, women, and children, the families of about a dozen giants, calmly went about their business. The normalcy of their lives struck me. The giants engaged in daily tasks with a sense of purpose and cooperation. Some of them cleaned, others constructed or repaired. Their living spaces were built into the hillsides, a time-proven way of protecting oneself from the elements while avoiding detection. Here, in the middle of nowhere, on a planet of billions, lived a self-sustaining society of somewhat primitive means, without so much as doors or fences. Fear of predators or theft wasn't high on their minds. The entire village was overgrown, and while we were in a clearing far above us, a canopy of trees shielded the compound from outside views. It was apparent from the outset that these giants had mastered the art of living discreetly. I watched a group of gigantic children playing. The noise of their movements and voices nauseated me, and I climbed deeper into my host's ear for protection. But not for long. When they saw us coming, everyone froze and quieted. "What is that in your ear? Let me squash it," one giant woman, apparently my host's partner, said. "No!" My friend turned. "It's a man." The giant woman's eyes flew open. "A tiny man! Jim brought a tiner!" A hubbub broke out. "Mommy, Mommy, look! A tiny man!" My friend Jim lowered himself to let the children have a look at me, but not everyone was thrilled.
"Why did you bring him to our sanctuary?"
asked an older man. "A boar threatened him," said Jim. His statement reverberated as an odd coincidence. "How did you know I was down there?" I asked. "I saw you land. Good fortune, really. We don't get many guests around here, well, until recently. But we're being rude. Let me show you around." Jim stepped into one of their living units, visibly relieved to leave the questioning crowd behind. The cave interior was much nicer, modern, you might even say, than the exterior gave away. "But don't you get bored in your tiny, excuse the pun, world here?" "We take excursions at night," Jim said. "Keep in mind that no one is looking for us. Nobody knows we exist, and people aren't interested in this area. Besides, every once in a while we visit your cities. Have you never heard the stories of giants roaming the streets at night?" My face must have shown that I had, and the giant smiled. "Also," Jim continued while grinning, "the occasional sighting is always dismissed as nonsense, especially when they come from children." I considered his statements. "But don't you want the thrill of space exploration?" I asked, being a spacer and all. Here the giant shook his head, dizzying me. Realizing my discomfort, he quickly thought better of it and stopped. "No, the energy needed to shoot full-sized humans into space is outrageous. We explore the oceans, we swim, but also mountains at night, climbing." I nodded. Throughout my visit, I was constantly reminded of the giants' deep connection to the environment and their minimalistic yet profound approach to life. They lived off the land, requiring no more than what nature provided, a stark contrast to the consumerism of my world. "Are you of a different race? Have your people always been big?" "Well, yes," said Jim. "We're the original size of humanity." When the giant observed that I didn't comprehend, he continued, "Remember how I told you that you were one of us? It is true." He set me down on a leaf and lit his great pipe. It felt like story time was about to begin, yet I knew every one of the giant's words was true. "You may think of your civilization as grand or enormous," the giant said, taking a puff of smoke. "Past science fiction writers even envisioned our world as expanding. In reality, it is tiny. A breakthrough in technology has resulted in Earth's entire population being shrunk to a fraction of its original size. Without this vital advance, flying cars, mass space travel, or journeys to the stars would have never existed." I shook my head in gaping disbelief. "Have you ever wondered why some public infrastructure is so enormously outsized? Do you truly need a 50-lane bridge?" asked the giant. "I always thought people built them to be grand, to stand out," I said. Jim shook his head. "Well, it might be hard to believe now, but they were adequately sized when they were built. I know, it sounds incredible, but hear me out," the giant said. I nodded, my mouth still open. The reduction technology's foundation, as so many things back then, was laid by lazy tech billionaires. One of them, looking to silence their neighbor's barking dog, assigned a sizable team of engineers to the problem. After many failures, the executive grew impatient. He defied his team and used an untested prototype on the animal. Instead of silencing the dog, it shrunk the beast. This terrified the engineers, but pleased the tech baron. Here, Jim rose and grabbed a barreled device that was mounted decoratively on his wall. "This," he pondered, "is the original shrinker." I had just closed my mouth, but here it reopened. Jim continued. "The first known reduced human was a club's bouncer who stood in the tech baron's way. After much fun with the tiny brawler, the billionaire realized the unique entertainment potential of the technology. He ordered miniature environments and dropped tiny individuals into these dioramas for his personal amusement. Soon, the displays spread to his deep-pocketed executive friends. Some recreated historical battlefields, others built fish tanks with mini divers for decoration. This was the only use of the shrinking technology that tech barons cared about, and for the longest time, few people knew of its existence. I was about to ask the giant for the way to the bathroom, but then thought better of it, and he continued. One day, yet another shrinking went wrong, and a tech overlord accidentally reduced herself. The genius now realized that her mere toilet had become a swimming pool, her mesh office chair a trampoline, her smartphone an oversized TV. Her means had increased tenfold, not by growing her immense fortune, but by reducing herself and her needs. Thus, shrinking themselves turned into a tech elite fad, with some even organizing shrunk hunts for bugs and other small critters. Here the mighty man Jimp filled a thimble with a drop of wine and handed it to me. I gulped and gulped like it was a barrel, suddenly understanding the allure of the small. The giant grinned as he read my face, refilled the thimble, took a tiny sip, and all was gone. He winked at me and continued. It took yet another mishap to get word out to the public. After another malfunction, the population of an entire town was reduced to the size of a laser disc. This caused brief amusement, but when the shrunken kids started gliding around on paper planes, they caught people's attention. Was there something to be learned here? Jimp the giant stretched his arms and yawned. It had grown late. It turned out that not everyone desired to grow again, my giant friend said, continuing in a hushed voice. For the stubborn, a tiny city was erected where tiners began farming and building with much reduced resources. The giant handed me a grain of wheat, which was the usual size of a football. And so, for a while, large and small inhabited this planet simultaneously. It is critical to understand that this occurred during a time when humanity was still coping with the planet's overcrowding. One day, when food, shelter, and energy for humanity's big people became scarce, frustration grew among scientists who could not provide enough rocket ships to settle other worlds. People back then did not understand that Earth was livable for any number of humans. They simply needed to be smaller. Efforts to solve the humanity's resource plights were focused on changing the environment rather than altering the people, the obvious solution. An insect can fly hundreds of kilometers, and the planet can easily sustain trillions of them. Jimp pointed out the window at the myriads of bugs going about their day. And thus the rapid reduction began. Initially, everyone was shrunk to the size of an 8-year-old child, about 50% for most people. That way, regular infrastructure remained usable during the transition. In Phase 1, people erected bridges between furniture, lowered door handles, sinks, and toilets, and cut their chair legs to facilitate Phase 2, the shrinking to 3 decimeters, until eventually all of humanity had reached 5 centimeters per person. Here I had to cut in. How come I've never heard of this technology? We and the ones before us took care of that. All the shrinkers were destroyed, all but one. He pointed at the enormous metal construction I had seen on my first overflight. I contemplated this. But most aliens are about our size. Correct, said Jimp the giant. Most spacefaring extraterrestrials have invented shrinking. The most efficient way to get off any planet is at your size, really. You're telling me that everyone on Earth agreed to be shrunk? At this, the giant laughed. Not all did. Some people objected to the shrinking of their manhoods. Others wanted their bills shrunk as well, and yet others suggested that the technology was best used on politicians' egos. But humor aside, the shrinking wasn't all a walk in the park. Many changes came about, some unanticipated. The expression the size of a pinhead suddenly referred to something enormous, while as thin as a hair now means something very broad. Those adorable little carts from flea circuses could now be used by people, and fleas became a force to be reckoned with. But what about the animals? I asked. They shrunk as many animals as possible, said Jimp. Yet there remained many insects and larger creatures, especially in the oceans. But why make the shrinking a secret? Certain forces wanted to prevent the shrinking. Some governments plotted secret returns to full size for global domination. None of this could be allowed by the Supreme Assembly, who wanted the best for humanity. This is the group we belong to. Our people decided to stay at humanity's original size, as guardians. I stopped at this for a moment of reflection. But wait, I then said. How come in old pictures trees and nature are the same size relative to people? The signs of the olden days are all around you, Jimp said. But you're not seeing them. I shrugged. You aren't looking hard enough. Just think about the giant statues still present everywhere, like the Lincoln Memorial in Thumerica. That isn't an oversized representation. That was his real size. Now I understand why we forbid our children to dream big, I said. The giant nodded knowingly. There are numerous advantages to being small that you may not be aware of. Viruses, for example, are much less of a threat for you now. They're too big to enter your body. I considered all this again and shook my head firmly. You're just pulling my leg. It was just too incredible of a story. I searched the giant's face for a grin. There wasn't any. Suddenly, a dark suspicion arose in me. Why did you share this story with me, after all the secrecy? That's when he stepped out of the shadows, another giant I hadn't seen. He looked familiar, but not entirely human. It was my lost friend. "Jockster!" I exclaimed aloud, yet my friend barely heard my tiny voice. "Dude?" My Borealis boarding buddy squinted. "That you?" He came in close and inspected me. "What are you doing here?" "I've come to rescue you," I said boldly, at once realizing the ridiculous supposition. My friend didn't seem altogether happy and said, "Rescue?" He bit his lip. "I should have known." I had little mind space to be irritated by his somewhat rude reply. So many questions swirled in my head. "When did the giants find you? How are you so big?" I asked. My friend took a pause and then said, "No, Anfred, I've returned." When I didn't immediately respond, he came in close to observe my expression. He then added, "These are my people." "But you're small like and you're an alien," I said. Jockster nodded. "Yes, I haven't always been giant," he said, taking a giant breath. "The Guardians recruited me." After all I had heard, I wasn't too surprised by anything. "But how did it come to that?" Jockster grinned. "I found the giants a long time ago when I landed in this jungle by mistake. As you know, I enjoy the outdoors and wish to help people. They asked me to join their cause. The giants also promised me one Borealis boarding vacation a year. I agreed. Wait. I cocked my head. Wait. Why are you guys telling me all these secrets?" I crawled back into Jimp's ear. "Are you going to squash me now?" "Here," Jimp stepped in. "No, Anfred, we want you to join too." Before I could scream, "Join?" Jimp continued. "We need more who understand both worlds, guardians who can bridge the gap between our small world, and the other world outside." I considered the proposal and after a good long while said, "You're overlooking one essential problem. I'm no giant." Both the giants shrugged. "That can be changed." I studied their faces, searching for any smirk to betray the joke they were setting up. I found none. "You know the shrinker outside? It also grows," Jimp then added. "We figured you wouldn't immediately agree and are prepared to offer you a test. We'll grow you to our size to see how you like it." I studied their faces again and squinted real hard this time. No, they weren't kidding. I nodded, and they led me to the giant structure I had seen flying over. Now, with more time to study its shape, it appeared to me like the early stages of an office tower construction with its trusses and girders. I gingerly stepped into the machine. Well, in fact, it took me many steps to walk to the center of it. I noticed 2 sets of stairs leading to and fro the square. One big, one small. I contemplated the larger ones, each step the size of a building story in my world, and found it hard to visualize that soon I would descend those myself without effort. "How long does it take?" I asked the giants. "Not long at all, only a few minutes," said Jockster. "To you, it'll feel much quicker, though. As you grow, your sense of time changes." I nodded. When I had reached the apparatus's center, I noticed concentric rings that covered its floor. I stopped and gestured to my friends. By now, all the giants had gathered around the machine, an unreal sight. To have these enormous, dark shapes around me bore unsettling connotations, even if they were friendly to me. It was absurd and spooky to behold. Jimp gestured for me to step with one foot into each of the rings. I now noticed a stick that was mounted at about my head height right in front of me. When I was in place, Jimp moved to a control console and gestured to use the stick in front of me. It was a microphone, a thoughtful addition to communicate between the sizes. "If stuff goes wrong, you guys know how to fix it?" I said into the microphone without having to yell for once. "Not really," Jimp said. I wanted to discuss this topic more, but then my surroundings began to blur. Hold as still as you can, Jimp advised me. I followed his guidance and now noticed the unsharpness around me taking direction, changing from a diffuse blur into a linear, vertical one. A dull droning entered my ears, and the loud, sonorous voices of the crowd became quieter and lost their force. My body tickled all over, and even though my legs didn't move, a sensation of motion overcame me. Nausea crept in. I felt dizzy and closed my eyes. When I reopened them, the columns that were the giant's legs had disappeared, and so had the deafening buzzing of the giant insects. Instead of staring at feet, I stared at faces. For a moment, I experienced a quiet much more profound than even that of outer space. Overall, the world around me had calmed and quieted, it seemed. It took a lot more bigger sound waves to move my gigantic eardrums now. "Welcome again, friend," Jockster said, grinning and shaking my hand. Jimp came in and patted my shoulder. "I had half expected to find my head above the trees," I said, laughing. "Yet the canopies are still well above us." "Come, come," said Jimp, holding my shoulder to steady me, while Jockster helped on the other side to show me around. While their village was familiar at that point, I now experienced it from a fresh and interesting perspective. "How do you like the air up here?" Jimp asked with a grin. "It's too thin," I said, still feeling dizzy. I had imagined a sensation of slowness in moving my limbs as a giant, but everything suddenly felt right at this size. My muscles reacted normally, only my brain needed a switch. A mosquito flew by. At first, I didn't recognize the life-threatening beast, but when I did, I casually smashed it with great delight. I must admit I enjoyed being large. "What do you think?" asked Jimp. I shook my head. "I can't give up space travel, even for this noble cause." I reached up into the sky. "Although I can practically grab Hawk at this size, can I?" We all laughed. "And then there's my family, of course." I got re-shrunk, but not after pushing my big, fat footprint into the mud, crafting a house from twigs that would soon be big enough for me to live in, and picking up my flyer, placing it closer to the village for convenience. On my return flight, and as civilization came back into view, I wondered whether I had made the right decision. As I head toward to the myriads of little people with their tiny problems, I knew that at least I wasn't alone in my dislikes. I had like-minders, and they were giants. Now when I gaze upon the stars, I feel even smaller, while also wondering whether there are even grander beings watching over us. And them. After all, many dinosaurs were of gigantic size, why not humans? Skeletal remains that big were never discovered, but what if time had simply washed the evidence away? I also speculate whether there are tinier people than us that have shrunk themselves into even smaller beings to preserve resources. It seems absurd in a universe of near unlimited size, yet our usable resources are only the ones within reach. This experience invited me to question, to reflect, and perhaps to dream of a future where the measure of humanity is not in its size, but in the breadth of its understanding and the stewardship of their home worlds. So, Post, why do I share this report with you after promising to the giants never to talk? I've recently installed an intelligent new email client. When it didn't find you in my address book, it assumed that despite the spelling, your name being Post, P-A-H-S-T, meant the past, as in times gone by. It looks like that's where all those messages my friend never received went, although I'll never know for sure if anyone received them at all. No one in my time will ever read this, I assume. I've fixed the mailing bug and fully expect my similarly named friend to receive all my future communication proper. Sorry, time's passed, but this is goodbye. All the best. End of transcription.
Well, there it is. Any of the previous messages, every single one, were sent to us by mistake. It's all been a blunder, a failure, a mishap. There was no desire to educate or send secret plans. Whether this is a statement from the original sender, I know not. Although the inability to send a simple email should come as no surprise after the unending reports of inability in the times ahead. It's an odd coincidence that both mine and the sender's narratives are coming to an end simultaneously. We best take the reports and prepare for the times ahead. Or you can. I'm writing these words on the beach at sunset, The undulating water soothes me. Something floats out there on the ocean. Smallish in size, a glimmer, a gleam not of the water itself. A change in refraction that's catching my attention. During my days here, nothing has come adrift but wood and coconut. This is a shiny object floating about 100 meters out. I see it now. It is a bottle.
You heard The Shrinking, Part 7 of the series Notes from the Ahead, written by Oliver Arnold and narrated by Adam 11 Labs.